When the life of a street girl crosses paths with that of a millionaire, the question, "Can I call you my daughter?" arises, and a simple smile changes everything. If you enjoy emotional stories, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. Continuing, Edward Miller had everything money could buy, but nothing else that truly mattered. At 45, he owned one of the largest logistics companies in the country, with branches spread across the national territory and contracts with the main industries in the United States. His name appeared on lists of the most influential businessmen, his signature was worth millions, and his mansion on the Upper East Side, one of New York City's most exclusive neighborhoods, was envied by many. But that enormous house, with its 6 bedrooms, heated pool, impeccable garden and a privileged view of the city, was merely a silent mausoleum where Edward lived alone, surrounded by ghosts and memories that hurt more than any physical wound. It had been 5 years since tragedy had ripped away everything that gave meaning to his existence. His wife, Camilla, and his son, Peter, only 4 years old, were no longer there. A terrible accident, sudden, without warning, without a chance to say goodbye. Edward still remembered the phone call, the trembling voice of the police officer, the desperate rush to the hospital, the feeling that the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. He remembered every detail of that cursed day, but he couldn't remember what it felt like to feel joy. Since then, his life had been reduced to mechanical movements, waking up, working, eating just enough not to faint, and sleeping little, always tormented by nightmares that made him wake up screaming in the middle of the night. He had tried to carry on. In the first few months, his friends called, invited him to dinner, tried to get him out of the house, but Edward knew they didn't understand. How could they? How could someone who still had their family intact comprehend the absurd emptiness of waking up every day and remembering that he would never again hear his son's laughter, never again feel his wife's embrace, never again have a Christmas, a birthday, a Sunday morning with pancakes and cartoons? Over time, he stopped answering calls. He stopped going out. He stopped trying. The company kept running because he had a competent team, but Edward was there only in body, like a ghost in the empire he had built. And then came the diagnosis. 3 months ago, after weeks of feeling profound fatigue, persistent back pain and unexplained weight loss, Edward finally yielded to his assistant's insistence and went to the doctor. The tests revealed what he, deep down, already expected: an aggressive cancer in an advanced stage. The doctors spoke of treatments, chemotherapy, experimental surgeries, statistical chances. But Edward heard only one phrase: 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, if he was lucky. He thanked them politely, left the office and decided he wouldn't do anything. No hospitals, no treatments that would prolong his suffering. He would just let the disease run its course, as if it were a high-speed train, finally taking him closer to Camilla and Peter. Perhaps, he thought during sleepless nights, on the other side there would be some kind of peace, or at least silence. It was on one of those grey August afternoons, with New York City's sky heavy and laden with dark clouds, that Edward decided to go for a walk. He had no destination, no purpose. He just put on a coat, grabbed his wallet on impulse, and started walking through the neighborhood streets. The cold wind cut his face, but he barely felt it. He walked through alleys, crossed busy avenues, passed by shops closing their doors, by street vendors collecting their goods. He observed everything with a strange detachment, as if watching a movie in which he was no longer the protagonist. People rushed past, each with their problems, their lives, their urgencies, and Edward was just another body in the crowd, invisible, irrelevant. It was then that he saw her. She was sitting on the sidewalk, leaning against the wall of an abandoned commercial building on the corner of Pine Street and Wall Street. She was a small girl, about 7 or 8 years old, with a dirty face, tangled dark hair falling over her thin shoulders. She wore an old t-shirt, too big for her frail body, and pants torn at the knees. In her lap, she held a battered plush dog with one ear torn and the stuffing coming out. There was a piece of cardboard next to her, where someone had written in a shaky hand, "Help, please." But what caught Edward's attention was not the evident misery, not the scene he had already seen hundreds of times on the streets of New York City. It was her gaze. The girl's eyes, brown and deep-set, had no tears. There was no plea, no self-pity. There was only a kind of tired resignation, but also a stubborn spark, a glimmer of something Edward couldn't name. Resistance, perhaps. Stubbornness, a refusal to completely give in. Edward stopped. He didn't know why. He was used to walking past scenes like that, not from a lack of compassion, but because he knew that giving a few coins wouldn't change anything, wouldn't solve the structural problem, wouldn't get that child out of there. But that day something inside him stirred. Perhaps it was the weariness of his own life. Perhaps it was the disease corroding his resistance. Perhaps it was just the fact that, for the first time in years, he saw someone who seemed as lost as he was. He approached slowly, as if afraid of scaring her. The girl raised her eyes, suspicious, but didn't move. Edward hesitated. His voice, when it finally came out, was hoarse, choked. "Have you had dinner today?" he asked, and realized how inadequate, insufficient, pathetic that phrase sounded in the face of the raw reality before him. The girl didn't answer. She just stared at him with those eyes too old for her age, eyes that had already seen things no child should see. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. He looked around, saw a bakery a few yards away, and without thinking much, he went in. He bought a ham and cheese sandwich, a small bottle of orange juice, and a piece of chocolate cake. When he returned, the girl was still there, motionless, as if afraid that any movement might make that moment of attention disappear. Edward held out the paper bag. She took it slowly, suspiciously, like a cornered animal unsure whether to trust. He said nothing, just sat beside her, right there on the cold sidewalk, leaning against the dirty wall of the building. He felt the freezing concrete through his pants, felt the dampness rising up his back, but he didn't care. They sat there side by side in silence. The girl ate quickly, too quickly, like someone who doesn't know when their next meal will be. Edward watched out of the corner of his eye, feeling a strange pain in his chest. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and murmured something so low he almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." Her voice was thin, fragile, but there was a dignity there that surprised him. Edward just nodded. He didn't know what to say. He had no words for that moment. They stayed there for a few more minutes, in shared silence. Edward couldn't explain it, but there was something in that silence that calmed him. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about Camilla, wasn't thinking about Peter, wasn't thinking about the disease that was eating him from within. He was just there, sitting on the cold sidewalk of an indifferent city, next to an abandoned child he didn't know. And for some inexplicable reason, it made sense. When he finally stood up, his legs were stiff, his back ached. He looked at the girl one last time, gave a slight nod, and continued on his way. But something had changed. He didn't know what, but something had moved inside him, like a stone dropped into a still lake, creating ripples that slowly expanded. The next night, Edward found himself thinking about her. Was she cold? Did she have somewhere to sleep? Was anyone taking care of her, or was she completely alone? He tried to push the thoughts away, tried to convince himself that it wasn't his problem, that he had his own issues to resolve, his own wounds to lick. But the image of those brown, old, stubborn eyes wouldn't leave his head. The next day, without planning, without thinking much, Edward returned to the same spot. He brought a better snack this time, a full hamburger, still warm fries and fresh juice. The girl was there in the same place, with the same plush dog in the same clothes. When she saw him approaching, something flickered across her face. It wasn't exactly joy, but perhaps a shy relief, a surprise that he had returned. Edward handed her the food and sat beside her again. This time as she ate, he ventured to speak. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl chewed slowly, as if considering whether to answer. "Laura," she finally said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Edward felt a tightening in his chest. Laura, a beautiful name, a name that deserved to be spoken with affection, not murmured on the edge of a dirty sidewalk. "And where do you live, Laura?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She just shrugged, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Here and there," she said, and there was so much resignation in that phrase that Edward felt like screaming, but he didn't scream. He just stayed there, in silence, respecting her space, respecting her pain. In the following days, it became a routine. Edward returned to the same spot, always in the late afternoon, always with food, always with something to offer. One time he brought a new coat he bought at a department store. Another time he brought a pair of children's sneakers. Yet another time he brought a children's storybook. Although he didn't know if she could read, Laura accepted everything in silence, with that distrust that only slowly diminished. Sometimes they talked a little, sometimes they just sat side by side, watching the city's movement, listening to the honking, the hurried footsteps of people passing. Without looking at them, Edward didn't know why he kept coming back. Perhaps because those moments were the only ones when he felt a little less empty. Perhaps because caring for someone, even in such a small and insignificant way, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't had in years. Or perhaps, just perhaps, because Laura reminded him that there was still innocence in the world, still struggle, still life wanting to pulse despite everything. It was on a Friday, after almost 2 weeks of these encounters, that Edward made a decision. It was raining heavily that afternoon, an August rain that turned New York City's streets into muddy rivers. He arrived at their usual spot, sheltered under a large umbrella, and found Laura huddled, trying to protect herself from the water with a piece of plastic that didn't work. She was trembling, her lips purplish, her soaked hair plastered to her face. Edward felt something break inside him. He couldn't leave her there. He couldn't just walk away knowing she would spend the entire night under that cold rain. He knelt in front of her, getting his pants wet, and looked into her eyes. "Laura," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "come with me. Just for a week. I'll give you shelter, food, a hot bath, clean clothes. Just 1 week, I promise. After that, if you want to leave, I'll bring you back. But not today. Today it's too cold, it's raining too much, please." Laura stared at him for a long moment. Edward saw the conflict in her eyes, distrust battling with desperation, fear battling with need. He waited without pressing, just holding the umbrella over both of them, letting her decide. Finally, slowly, Laura nodded. Edward felt such immense relief that he almost gasped. He helped her up, wrapped her in his coat, and together they walked to where his car was parked. Throughout the drive to the mansion on the Upper East Side, Laura remained silent, her eyes fixed on the window, observing the streets, the buildings, the city lights that shone through the rain. Edward said nothing. He just drove, his hands firm on the steering wheel, his heart beating faster than it had in years. When they arrived at the house, Laura seemed to shrink even further. She looked at the imposing facade, the automatic gate, the illuminated garden, and Edward saw incredulity stamped on her face. It was as if two completely opposite worlds were colliding at that instant. Luxury meeting deprivation, excess meeting lack, the emptiness of one who had everything meeting the fullness of one who had nothing. Edward opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "Come," he said softly. "You can come in, Laura. This house is too big for just one person." She hesitated but finally crossed the threshold, her bare feet leaving wet marks on the marble floor. Edward closed the door behind them, and for a moment he just looked at that small girl, soaked, trembling in the middle of the enormous living room. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt that house was more than just a mausoleum again. For the first time it was a home again. The first few days were harder than Edward had imagined. He had thought that simply offering a roof, food, security, and Laura would simply accept everything with gratitude. But the reality was much more complicated. The girl didn't trust him, didn't trust anything. She walked around the house like a caged animal, always alert, always tense, as if expecting everything to disappear or turn out to be a trap at any moment. When Edward showed her the room she could use, one of the guest rooms with a huge double bed, soft blankets, and a window overlooking the garden, Laura entered slowly, touching things as if they were made of glass, as if they could break at the slightest touch. She said nothing, just nodded and stood still in the middle of the room, her arms tucked against her body. On the first night, Edward prepared dinner. He wasn't an experienced cook, but he knew how to make the basics, and he made a simple spaghetti bolognese with plenty of grated cheese on top, the way Peter used to like it. When he called Laura to the table, she appeared hesitant, looking at the food as if she couldn't believe it was for her. "Sit," Edward said, trying to sound casual. though he felt a strange tension in the air. "Eat as much as you like, there's plenty." Laura sat on the edge of the chair, picked up the fork carefully and began to eat. Edward noticed that she ate too quickly, almost swallowing the food without chewing properly, like someone who doesn't know when their next meal will be. "Slowly," he said softly. "There's no need to rush. The food won't run out. There'll be more tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow too." Laura stopped, looked at him with those big suspicious eyes, and then, slowly, she slowed her pace. But Edward could see the tension in her every movement, the constant vigilance. After dinner, Edward showed her the bathroom, explained how the shower worked, left clean towels and a bathrobe that was too big for her, but at least it was warm. Laura locked herself in there for almost an hour. Edward waited in the living room, worried, unsure whether he should knock on the door or leave her alone. When she finally came out, her hair was wet, her face clean, and for the first time he could clearly see her features. She was beautiful, he realized, in a delicate and fragile way, but there were marks of neglect, of hunger, of sleepless nights. And there was something else, something he recognized immediately, because he also saw it in the mirror every day. The mark of one who carries pains that cannot be washed away, no matter how much hot water you use. That first night, Laura didn't sleep in the bed. Edward discovered this the next morning when he knocked on the bedroom door and got no answer. He entered carefully and found her huddled on the floor in a corner between the wall and the wardrobe, wrapped in the blanket, sleeping with the plush dog clutched to her chest. Edward's heart ached. He left the room without making a sound, went to the kitchen and prepared a lavish breakfast. Warm French bread, butter, strawberry jam, cheese, ham, freshly squeezed orange juice, and chocolate milk. When Laura appeared, still sleepy and frightened, he just smiled and said, "Good morning, Laura, come have breakfast." She approached slowly, sat at the table, and this time ate a little more slowly, though still with that visible tension in every gesture. The days passed like this, in a careful dance of approach and retreat. Edward tried not to be intrusive, not to ask too many questions, not to force anything. He was just there, present, offering what he could: food, shelter, kindness. He bought new clothes for Laura, and when she saw the bags full of t-shirts, pants, dresses, and a winter coat, her eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide. Edward pretended not to notice, just said she could choose whatever she wanted to wear, and if she didn't like anything, they could exchange it. Laura picked up a light pink t-shirt with a star design, held it against her chest, and murmured an almost inaudible, "Thank you." Edward felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't had for so long that he had almost forgotten its name: hope. It was on the fourth day that Laura began to open up. They were in the living room, Edward pretending to read a book he couldn't actually read, and Laura sitting on the floor drawing with colored pencils he had bought for her. Suddenly, without looking up from the paper, she spoke. "I lived with a woman who said she was my aunt." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but firm. Edward slowly closed the book, paying attention. "She used to hit me when I cried. She wouldn't let me eat when she said I was annoying. And there were men who came at night, strange men who looked at me in a way that scared me." Edward felt his blood run cold. He remained silent, waiting, not wanting to interrupt her. Laura continued drawing, but her hands trembled slightly. "One day I heard her talking on the phone. She said she had good new merchandise and that she could deliver it soon. I didn't know what it meant, but there were other girls who lived there before. They disappeared, never came back. And I was afraid I would disappear too." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the wave of nausea and anger that rose in his throat. When he opened his eyes again, Laura was looking at him, scared, as if afraid he would get angry or not believe her. Edward slowly stood up, crossed the room and knelt beside her. "Laura," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "You're not going back there, never, I won't let you." The girl stared at him, and for the first time since they met, he saw tears streaming down her face. Edward opened his arms, hesitant, and to his surprise, Laura threw herself into them, sobbing against his chest. He held her carefully, as if she were made of glass, and felt his own tears stream down his face. They were tears of anger, of indignation, but also of something he hadn't felt in years, a fierce desire to protect, to fight, not to let the world destroy another innocent life. After that day, their coexistence changed. Laura still had moments of retreat, still slept on the floor some nights, still ate too quickly sometimes, But little by little she began to relax. She started to smile occasionally, a shy smile that lit up her entire face. She started asking questions, exploring the house, playing in the garden. Edward bought more toys, storybooks, children's movies. They created small routines. Every afternoon after Edward finished work, they drew together in the living room. Every night before bed, Edward read her a story. Every Friday they ordered pizza and watched a movie. These were simple things, even mundane, but they filled that enormous house with something it hadn't had in years. Edward also noticed changes in himself. For the first time since the diagnosis, he began to pay attention to his own body again. The back pain continued, as did the fatigue, but there was something different. He was sleeping better. He was eating more. He was waking up in the morning with a reason to get out of bed, even if that reason was just to prepare breakfast for a 7-year-old girl who looked at him as if he were a hero. One day his assistant, Robert, showed up at the house with some documents for him to sign. He was a middle-aged man who had worked with Edward for over 15 years and who had never lost faith that his boss would return to his old self. When he saw Laura running through the garden, laughing as she chased a butterfly, Robert looked at Edward with surprise and hope. "Is she living here?" he asked, trying not to show too much emotion. Edward nodded. "For now," he said. "It's a long story." Robert put his hand on his shoulder and squeezed. "Edward, you need to start taking care of yourself again. You need to go back to the doctor. That experimental treatment Dr. Carter mentioned, you should consider it, at least try." Edward was going to refuse, as he always did. But then Laura ran in through the door, holding the imaginary butterfly in her cupped hands, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Look, Edward, I caught it," she said, laughing. "It's the most beautiful in the world." Edward felt something break inside him. For the first time since the tragedy, he wanted the future. He wanted to be there next week, next month, next year. He wanted to see Laura grow up, learn, become the person she deserved to be. He looked at Robert and nodded slowly. "Make an appointment," he said. "I'll see what Dr. Carter can do." Robert smiled, and Edward saw tears in his friend's eyes. "I'll make it today," he promised. The weeks passed and the routine solidified. Edward began the experimental treatment, which was difficult and painful, but he endured it because now he had a reason. Laura, in turn, was transforming. She was no longer that scared girl on the sidewalk. She was gaining weight, her hair was shiny, her cheeks had color. She laughed more, played more, talked more. One night, as Edward tucked her into bed, she held his hand and said, "Can I call you Dad?" Edward felt the world stop. He looked at that girl, at those eyes that were no longer so old, that no longer carried only pain, and felt his heart explode in his chest. "Yes," he said, his voice choked. "You can call me whatever you want, Laura." Laura smiled. That smile that was becoming more and more frequent, and whispered, "Good night, Dad." Edward left the room, closed the door, and for the first time in 5 years, he cried tears of joy. But the fragile happiness they were building would not last long. It was on a Saturday morning, when Edward and Laura were in the garden planting flowers, that the doorbell rang. Edward went to answer it, still with his hands dirty from the soil, and found a woman in her 40s, thin, with disheveled hair and hard eyes. Beside her was a man in a suit, carrying a briefcase full of documents. The woman looked him up and down and said in a harsh voice, "I've come for my niece." Edward felt his blood run cold. "Excuse me," he said, trying to remain calm. "Who are you?" The woman smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. "I am Vera Smith, Laura Marie Smith's aunt and legal guardian. And this is my lawyer, Mr. Mark Davis. I've come to take the girl you are illegally keeping in your home." Edward felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Before he could respond, he heard a scream behind him. He turned and saw Laura standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "No!" she cried, her voice high with panic. "No, I'm not going, I'm not going." She ran to Edward and clung to his leg, trembling violently. "Please, Dad, don't let her take me, please." Edward held her, pulling her close, feeling fury explode inside him. The woman took a step forward, but Edward blocked the entrance. "You will not lay a finger on her," he said, his voice low but dangerous. Vera smiled again, that cruel smile. "Oh, I won't. I have the documents here, proving I am her legal guardian. You, on the other hand, have no right to this child. It's kidnapping, in fact. But I'm willing not to call the police if you return the girl now." Edward looked at the lawyer, who had a professional but slightly uncomfortable expression. He looked at the woman at those cold, calculating eyes, and then he looked at Laura, who was holding him with desperate strength, her face wet with tears. And at that moment, Edward Miller made a decision. He wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to hand that girl over to that woman, no matter what it cost, no matter what he had to do. He was going to fight. "You will not take her today," he said, his voice firm. "I will contact my lawyers, and we will resolve this the proper way. If you truly have legal rights over Laura, then that will be decided in court. Until then, she stays with me." Vera narrowed her eyes. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice full of venom. "We'll sue you for kidnapping, for coercion of a minor, for everything we can. And when I win, and I will win, I'll make sure you never get near her again." The lawyer touched Vera's arm, whispering something. She gave one last venomous look at Edward and Laura, turned and left, leaving a heavy threat in the air. Edward closed the door and immediately knelt, hugging Laura tightly. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if it was. "I won't let her take you. I promise." Laura sobbed uncontrollably, and Edward carried her to the sofa, holding her until her sobs subsided. When she finally calmed down a bit, he wiped the tears from her face and said, "Laura, I need you to tell me everything about this woman. Everything you remember." Laura swallowed hard and began to speak, her voice broken. "She said she was my mom's aunt, that my mom had died and that she would take care of me. But she didn't take care of me. She just wanted the money." Edward frowned. "What money, Laura?" The girl shrugged. "I don't know. But I heard her talking once that she had received a lot of money because of my dad, and that she was going to use it to live well. But she never gave me anything, and then she started talking about giving me to other people, to earn more money. That's why I ran away." Edward felt anger boil inside him. He picked up the phone and called Robert. "I need you here now," he said, "and bring me the name of the best family lawyer you know." Robert didn't ask questions. "I'm on my way," he said. In less than an hour, Robert was there, along with a lawyer named Dr. Beatrice Moore, a woman in her early 50s, with intelligent eyes and a serious expression. She listened to the whole story, took careful notes, and then looked at Edward. "Mr. Miller, I'm going to be frank with you. The situation is complicated. If this woman truly has legal guardianship, it will be difficult to take it away from her, especially considering you have no legal ties to the child. But there are things here that don't make sense. I'll need to investigate. I need to know who this woman is, her history with Laura's family, and especially where this money she mentioned came from." Edward hired the lawyer on the spot and also hired a private investigator, a former police officer named George, who had worked a few times for the company doing background checks. George was discreet, efficient, and had contacts throughout the city. In the following days, while Edward tried to maintain a routine with Laura, trying to make her feel safe despite the threat hanging over them, George investigated. And what he discovered was shocking. Vera Smith had a history of involvement with exploitation networks, though she had never been formally accused or arrested. She had been a guardian to other children before, all of whom had disappeared without a trace. But what most shook Edward was another discovery. Laura's father, Paul Smith, had been an employee of Edward's logistics company. He had worked as a truck driver and had died 6 years ago in a work accident, when the vehicle he was driving lost its brakes on a highway descent. The company had paid significant compensation to Laura's guardian, who at the time was less than 2 years old. Vera had received the money, spent it all for her own benefit, and then simply abandoned the girl to her fate. Edward couldn't believe it. Laura's father had worked for him. He had been one of his employees, and he, Edward, had never known, had never done anything to ensure that the man's daughter was well cared for. Guilt gnawed at him. He felt that in some way he had failed that man, he had failed Laura. But now he had a chance to fix it. He had a chance to give Laura the life she deserved, the life her father would have wanted for her. One night, while sifting through old company files, Edward found something that made him stop. It was a letter, handwritten, kept with Paul Smith's accident documents. The handwriting was simple. The words were from a man who didn't have much formal education, but who had an immense heart. The letter said, "If one day I'm not here, I want you to find someone who truly loves my daughter, as if they chose her. Because true love is a choice, not an obligation. I want her to be happy, to have a good life, to know that her father loved her more than anything in this world." Edward read the letter aloud to Laura, sitting together on the sofa, the soft lamplight illuminating the yellowed paper. When he finished, Laura was crying silently. "My dad wrote this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward nodded, unable to speak. Laura snuggled against him and whispered, "He wanted someone to truly love me." Edward hugged her tightly and said, his voice choked, "And someone does." "Laura, I do. I chose you and I will fight for you until the end." Laura looked up, her eyes red but shining with a light Edward recognized as hope. "I chose you too, Dad," she said. And for the first time since that woman had appeared at the door, Edward felt that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to win that battle. The following weeks were the most difficult Edward had ever faced, and that included the months after Camilla and Peter's deaths. It included the terminal diagnosis. It included all the pains he thought he had overcome. But this time was different. This time it wasn't about him. It was about Laura, about protecting that child who had become his reason for living. Dr. Beatrice worked tirelessly, building the case, gathering evidence, preparing the defense. The investigator George kept digging, looking for anything that could be used against Vera Smith. And Edward did what he could. He tried to keep Laura safe, happy, protected from the storm brewing around them. Vera was quick to act. 3 days after her appearance at Edward's house, he received a court summons. She was suing him for unlawful retention of a minor, demanding that Laura be immediately handed over to her, and also seeking compensation for moral damages. Her lawyer, Mark Davis, was known for taking dubious cases as long as they paid well, and he was doing an efficient job of distorting the narrative. In the papers he presented to the court, Edward appeared as a disturbed man, still grieving the loss of his family, who had become unhealthily attached to a vulnerable child found on the streets. Vera, on the other hand, was painted as a loving aunt who had desperately searched for her missing niece, and who had finally found her in the hands of a rich stranger who refused to return her. Dr. Beatrice showed the documents to Edward on a rainy September afternoon. They were in his office, in the room he rarely used, surrounded by piles of papers, reports, documents. "Edward," she said, maintaining a professional tone but with a glint of concern in her eyes, "they are building a convincing narrative. We have to deconstruct it piece by piece, and it won't be easy. We need to prove that Vera is not a suitable guardian, that she has a history of neglect and possibly more serious crimes. But the problem is that she has never been formally accused of anything. All the evidence George found is circumstantial." Edward ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation. "What about Laura's father's letter?" he asked. "Doesn't that count for anything?" Dr. Beatrice sighed. "It counts. It shows that her father wanted her to have a better life, to be loved. But it doesn't change the fact that Vera has legal guardianship. The letter doesn't specify who should care for Laura, so we can't use it to automatically remove her guardianship. What we can do is use all of this to build a case that the child's best interest is to stay with you." "But Edward, I need to be honest. The odds are not in our favor. The system tends to favor blood relatives, even when they are not ideal. And you, despite all your good intentions, have no legal or blood connection to Laura." Edward felt despair tighten his chest. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice tense. Dr. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes determined. "We fight," she said simply. "We fight with everything we have." George continued investigating, and every day brought new information. He discovered that Vera had moved cities several times in recent years, always leaving debts behind. He discovered that she had connections to people of dubious reputation, men who had been arrested for exploitation-related crimes. He discovered that other children who had been under her care had simply disappeared from official records without satisfactory explanation. But all of this, as Dr. Beatrice constantly repeated, was circumstantial. There was no concrete evidence, no formal complaints, nothing that could be used to arrest her or definitively remove her guardianship. It was like fighting a shadow, something you knew was there but couldn't grasp. Meanwhile, Edward's health was surprisingly improving. The doctors were impressed with his response to the experimental treatment. The tumors were shrinking, markers were falling, and although he was still far from being considered cured, for the first time since the diagnosis, there was real hope that he could survive. Dr. Carter, the oncologist who was treating him, said in one of the consultations, "Edward, I don't know if it's the treatment, if it's luck, or if it's something else, but you are responding better than any other patient I've seen with your condition. Keep doing what you're doing because it's working." Edward knew what was working. It was Laura. It was waking up every day with a purpose. It was having someone depend on him. It was feeling that his life had meaning again. It was love, pure and simple. Laura, in turn, was becoming increasingly integrated into life at the mansion. Edward enrolled her in a nearby private school, a good school where she could get a quality education and make friends. In the first few days, Laura was scared, thinking she wouldn't be able to keep up with the other children who had been studying for years. But she was intelligent, learned quickly, and soon was getting good grades, bringing home assignments with pride stamped on her face. Her teachers called Edward, impressed with her dedication, with her desire to learn. One of them, Teacher Martha, said in a meeting, "Mr. Miller, Laura is a special girl. She has a determination I rarely see in children her age. You are doing a wonderful job with her." Edward felt his eyes sting. "It's not me," he said. "It's her. She's strong, stronger than any of us." But Vera's shadow hung over everything. Laura had frequent nightmares, woke up in the middle of the night screaming, saying the woman had come to take her. Edward would rush to her room, turn on the lights, hold her until she calmed down. "It's okay," he repeated like a mantra. "I'm here, you're safe. No one is going to take you." But he knew these were promises he might not be able to keep. The hearing date was approaching, and with it came the paralyzing fear that the judge would rule in Vera's favor, and he would have to see Laura being taken away, screaming, begging to stay. A week before the hearing, George arrived with an important discovery. "Edward," he said, his eyes shining with contained excitement, "I found something. I found one of the girls who was under Vera's care a few years ago. She's 18 now, lives in Philadelphia, and is willing to testify." Edward felt his heart race. "She'll tell what happened?" he asked. George nodded. "She will, and it's not pretty. Vera kept her locked up, beat her, tried to sell her to a man when she was 15. She managed to escape, went to a shelter, and has been trying to rebuild her life ever since. But she's scared. Scared that Vera will find out where she is, scared of retaliation. We'll need to ensure protection for her." Dr. Beatrice immediately contacted the district attorney's office, explained the situation, and arranged for the girl, whose name was Renee, to be placed under temporary witness protection. Renee agreed to testify, but only if she could do so in a protected manner, without having to face Vera directly. The judge accepted the request, and that gave Edward a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, that testimony would be enough to change the course of the case. Maybe it was the missing piece to show the court who Vera really was. But Dr. Beatrice warned him not to get his hopes up too much. "The testimony will help," she said, "but it's no guarantee. The system is complicated, and judges have to follow the law. The law still favors blood relatives, unless we can prove imminent danger to the child. And proving that is harder than it seems." The night before the hearing, Edward barely slept. He stayed in the living room late, looking out at the dark garden through the window, thinking about everything that had happened since that day he found Laura on the sidewalk. How his life had changed, how he had changed. Before Laura, he was just waiting to die, counting the days until the disease took him. Now he wanted to live. He wanted to see Laura grow up, graduate, maybe get married one day, have her own children. He wanted to be there for every achievement, every challenge, every important moment of her life. But all of this depended on a judge, on a man he had never seen, who would decide their fate based on papers, laws, arguments. The impotence was suffocating. Laura appeared in the living room barefoot, holding the plush dog. "Can't sleep?" Tashi asked softly. Edward motioned for her to come closer, and she sat beside him on the sofa, snuggling against his arm. "Me neither," he admitted. "I'm scared about tomorrow." Laura was silent for a moment and then said, "I'm scared too, but you promised you would fight for me. You promised you wouldn't let her take me." Edward hugged her tighter. "And I won't," he said with all the conviction he could muster. "No matter what happens tomorrow, Laura, I will fight until the end. You are my daughter. Not on paper yet, but in my heart you are. And nothing and no one will change that." Laura looked up at him, and Edward saw in her eyes a confidence that both warmed and terrified him. He couldn't fail. He couldn't disappoint that child who had placed all her faith in him. On the day of the hearing, Edward put on his best suit, even though his hands trembled as he buttoned his shirt. Laura wore a blue dress he had bought for her, brushed her hair until it shone, and held his hand tightly as they entered the courthouse. The building was imposing, cold, full of corridors that echoed footsteps and voices. Dr. Beatrice met them at the entrance, reviewed the documents one last time, and gave final instructions. "Laura," she said, kneeling to be at the girl's height, "today you might need to speak to the judge. Don't be afraid. Just tell the truth. Tell him what you feel, what you want, okay?" Laura nodded, but Edward could feel the tremor in her small hand. When they entered the courtroom, Edward saw Vera for the first time since that day at his door. She was sitting on the other side of the room next to her lawyer, dressed soberly and appropriately, with an expression of maternal concern that Edward knew to be false. When Laura saw her, she cringed against Edward, and he felt the tension in her small body. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here." Vera looked at them and managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Edward felt like crossing the room and tearing that fake smile from her face, but he controlled himself. He couldn't do anything that would harm the case. He had to trust the system, however difficult it was. The judge entered, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious but not unfriendly expression. Everyone stood and the hearing began. Vera's lawyer spoke first, presenting his version of the facts. He painted Edward as a disturbed man who had kidnapped a vulnerable child, taking advantage of her situation. He said that Vera had searched for Laura for months, that she was desperate, that she only wanted her niece back to give her the love and care she deserved. He presented documents proving guardianship, certificates, papers that seemed in order. Edward listened to everything with his blood boiling, but he remained quiet. Dr. Beatrice had instructed him not to react, no matter what was said. When it was the defense's turn, Dr. Beatrice meticulously presented her evidence. She spoke about the state in which Laura was found, abandoned, alone, uncared for. She spoke about the girl's dramatic improvement since she had been with Edward, both physically and emotionally. She presented medical reports, school reports, letters from teachers attesting to Laura's progress. She spoke about the investigation that had revealed Vera's dubious history, the children who had disappeared under her care, the connections to dangerous people. And then she called Renee to testify. The young woman entered the room trembling, escorted by an officer, and gave her testimony through a screen so that Vera could not see her directly. Her voice was low but firm. She spoke of years of abuse, neglect, and terror. She told how Vera treated her like merchandise, how she tried to sell her to a man when she was 15, how she had to flee to save her own life. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Vera's lawyer tried to discredit the testimony, saying that Renee was a problematic young woman with a history of running away and lying. But Dr. Beatrice counter-argued, presenting documents from the shelter where Renee had stayed, reports from social workers who confirmed her story. The battle continued for hours, each side presenting arguments, evidence, trying to convince the judge. Edward felt exhausted, drained, but he didn't take his eyes off the judge, trying to read in his expression some clue as to which way he was leaning. But the man remained impenetrable, only taking notes, asking pointed questions, remaining neutral. And then the judge did something no one expected. He asked to speak with Laura, alone. Dr. Beatrice looked at Edward, who looked at Laura. The girl was pale, but when the judge called her name gently, she stood up. Edward squeezed her hand one last time. "Be brave," he whispered. "Tell the truth." Laura nodded and followed the judge into a separate room. The minutes that followed were the longest of Edward's life. He sat there, his hands sweating, his heart beating so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Dr. Beatrice placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to convey calm, but he could see that she was also tense. That moment could decide everything. When Laura returned, her eyes were red, but there was a determination on her face that Edward recognized. The judge returned shortly after, sat down and looked at everyone in the room. "I will need time to analyze all the evidence and testimonies presented," he said. "This is not a decision to be taken lightly. A child's well-being is at stake, and I need to be sure that I am making the right choice. I will study the case carefully and will give my decision in 1 week. Until then, the situation remains as it is. Laura will remain under the care of Mr. Edward Miller, with regular supervision from a social worker. The hearing is adjourned." Edward didn't know whether to feel relief or more anxiety. A week, 7 more days of uncertainty, fear, waiting. But at least Laura would stay with him during that time. At least he didn't have to hand her over that day. They left the courthouse in silence, Laura holding his hand tightly. Dr. Beatrice said it had been a good hearing, that she thought they had a chance, but Edward barely heard. He could only think of the week to come, the 7 days that could change everything. When they arrived home, Laura went straight to her room. Edward followed her and found her lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. He sat beside her and asked softly, "What did the judge ask you?" Laura turned to look at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He asked where I wanted to stay, what I felt, if I was afraid of anything." Edward swallowed hard. "And what did you say?" Laura sat up and hugged him tightly. "I said you called me your daughter, even before I understood what it was to have a father." And I smiled, because for the first time I felt like I had a home. Edward felt tears stream down his face. He hugged Laura back, and they stayed like that for a long time, 2 human beings scarred by life, clinging to each other as if they were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. The week of waiting was torture. Each day seemed to last an eternity. Each hour dragged as if time had decided to slow down, just to prolong the agony. Edward tried to maintain normalcy, tried to make sure Laura didn't notice how terrified he was, but it was difficult. He would wake up in the middle of the night with his heart pounding, imagining terrible scenarios where the judge ruled in Vera's favor, where he had to watch Laura being taken away screaming, begging to stay. He imagined the house empty again, that deadly silence returning to dominate every room. And those thoughts were so unbearable that he needed to get up, go to Laura's room just to see her sleeping peacefully, just to remind himself that she was still there, still with him. Laura was also tense, though she tried to hide it. She played less, smiled less, was quieter. One night, as they were having dinner, she dropped her fork and asked in a small voice, "Dad, what if the judge says I have to leave? What if he doesn't believe me?" Edward dropped his own fork and reached across the table, holding her hand. "Laura, look at me," he said, waiting until she raised her eyes. "No matter what the judge decides, no matter what happens, I will never give up on you. If he says you have to go, I will appeal. I will go to the Superior Court. I will go to the Supreme Court if necessary. I will fight until I have no strength left, and then I will fight a little more. Because you are my daughter, Laura. It may not be on paper yet, but it's here," he said, placing his hand on his chest. "And no one can change that." Laura squeezed his hand, and Edward saw a tear roll down her face. "I won't give up on you either, Dad," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Before I met you, I thought I would never have a real family. I thought I would be alone forever. But you showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice. It's about love." Edward felt his chest tighten so hard he could barely breathe. He stood up, walked around the table, and hugged Laura with all the strength he had. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 hearts beating together, 2 human beings who had found each other at the exact moment when both most needed salvation. The days passed, and finally the moment arrived. Friday, 10 in the morning, the decision would be announced. Edward and Laura arrived at the courthouse half an hour early, accompanied by Dr. Beatrice and Robert, who had insisted on being present. The lawyer was confident but cautious. "Edward," she said as they waited in the hallway, "I did everything I could. We presented a solid case, we have witnesses, we have evidence. But in the end, it will depend on the judge, on how he interprets the law and what he considers to be best for Laura. We need to be prepared for any outcome." Edward nodded, but inside he felt as if he was on the edge of a cliff, balancing on a thin rope that could break at any moment. When they entered the courtroom, Vera was already there along with her lawyer. She looked at Laura with an expression Edward couldn't fully decipher. There was anger there, certainly, but also something more, something calculating, as if she was already planning her next move if she lost. The judge entered and everyone stood. Edward felt his legs weak, but he forced himself to stand upright to maintain his composure. The judge sat down, arranged the papers in front of him, and began to speak. His voice was clear, professional, but Edward could detect a note of emotion there, as if that decision had also affected him personally. "This has been one of the most complex cases I have ever analyzed," the judge began. "On one side we have a legal guardian. with documents proving her right over the child. On the other, we have a man with no legal or blood connection, but who has clearly developed a deep bond with the minor. I have analyzed all the evidence presented, heard all the testimonies, and most importantly, I have spoken extensively with Laura herself. Edward's heart was beating so fast he thought he was going to faint. Laura squeezed his hand tightly, and he squeezed back, trying to convey a reassurance he didn't feel. The judge continued, his expression serious but not without compassion. The law is clear regarding the preference for blood relatives in the guardianship of minors. However, the law is also clear regarding the absolute priority of the child's well-being, and in this case, after careful analysis of all the facts, the conditions in which Laura was found, the testimony of Renee Silva, and especially my own conversation with Laura, I have reached a conclusion. The judge paused, and those seconds of silence were the longest of Edward's life. I decide for the destitution of Vera Smith's guardianship, and for the granting of temporary custody of Laura Marie Smith to Mr. Edward Miller, under the supervision of Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office for a period of 6 months, at the end of which the situation will be re-evaluated for possible definitive adoption. Edward felt the world stop. For a moment he couldn't process the words. Temporary custody. Laura would stay with him. She would stay with him. He looked at Laura and saw her face light up, saw a huge smile spread, saw tears of relief stream down her cheeks. She threw herself into his arms and Edward held her, feeling his own tears flow freely. In the background he could hear Vera shouting, protesting, her lawyer trying to argue, but the judge banged his gavel and maintained his decision. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice harder now, I determined the opening of an inquiry to investigate the allegations of neglect, abuse, and possible involvement with child exploitation on the part of Miss Vera Smith. The police will be notified, and the investigation will follow its legal course. Vera was escorted out of the room still shouting threats, saying she would appeal, that it wasn't over. But Edward barely paid attention. He could only focus on Laura, on her arms around his neck, on her voice quietly saying, "Oh, Dad, we won. We won." Dr. Beatrice was smiling, wiping her own eyes, and Robert had his hand on Edward's shoulder, squeezing hard. When they finally left the courthouse, the sun was shining, and for the first time in years Edward felt that the world was right, that there was justice, that there was hope. That night they celebrated at home, just the three of them, Edward, Laura, and Robert, who was practically family now. They ordered pizza, watched a silly movie that made everyone laugh, and when Laura finally went to sleep happy and peaceful, Edward stayed in the living room with Robert, having coffee. "You saved her," Robert said, "but I think she saved you too, didn't she?" Edward nodded, looking at the cup in his hands. "I was dead, Robert. Not physically, but inside. I had no more reason to live, to fight. And then I found her, this small, stubborn girl who refused to give up despite everything. And she reminded me that life is still worth living, even when it hurts, even when it seems impossible. She gave me back my humanity." Robert smiled. "And you gave her a family, a home, love. I think you saved each other. And that's rare, Edward. That's special." The following months were of rebuilding and healing. Edward continued the treatment, and the results were increasingly encouraging. 6 months after the hearing, the doctors performed new tests and the result was almost miraculous. There were no more signs of active cancer. He was in complete remission. Dr. Carter called it extraordinary luck, but Edward knew it was more than that. It was the will to live. It was having a reason to wake up every day. It was the love that motivated him to fight. Laura was flourishing. At school she was one of the best students, curious, dedicated, always asking questions, always wanting to learn more. She made friends, participated in activities, had a normal life for an 8-year-old child. But more than that, she had a home. She had a father who loved her unconditionally, who was present at every school meeting, every event, every important moment. When the 6-month period arrived, there was a new hearing to evaluate the situation. This time it was simple, quick. The social worker who had been following the case submitted a brilliant report on Laura's progress, on the healthy family structure, on the clearly strong bond between her and Edward. The judge didn't even hesitate. "I grant the definitive adoption of Laura Marie Smith by Edward Miller," he declared. "As of today, she is officially your daughter, with all the rights and duties that implies. Edward signed the papers with trembling hands, and when he looked at Laura, he saw that she was crying. But they were tears of joy. "I'm really your daughter now," she said, amazed. "Really real on paper and everything." Edward picked her up, even though she was getting a bit big for it. "You've always been my real daughter," he said. Feather paper just made official what was already true in our hearts. Edward also decided to do something more. He started writing a book, telling the whole story from the beginning. From that day he found Laura on the sidewalk, from the decision to take her home, from the legal battle, from everything. He called the book "Can I Call You Daughter?" And because that had been Laura's question on that transformative night, the question that had changed everything. Writing was therapeutic. It was a way to process everything that had happened, all the emotions, all the fears and joys, and it was also a way to leave a record so that Laura could one day read and fully understand the journey they had taken together. The book took 2 years to complete, but when it was finally published, it became a surprising success. People from all over the country wrote to Edward, telling their own stories of adoption, of love that transcends blood, of families formed by choice and not by chance. As for Vera, the investigation revealed things even worse than they imagined. She was indicted for document forgery, fraud, extortion, and finally, for involvement in a child exploitation network. Other victims came forward, encouraged by Renee's testimony and Laura's courage. Vera was tried and convicted, finally paying for all the crimes she had committed. Edward felt no pleasure in her conviction, just a quiet relief that she could no longer hurt other children. Laura, when she heard the news, was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I hope she learns to be a better person. Not for me, but for herself, because living with so much anger in your heart must be very heavy." Edward was impressed by her maturity, by her capacity for forgiveness, and realized that despite everything she had been through, Laura had maintained her good essence, her kind heart. The years passed, and Edward and Laura's life settled into a happy and stable routine. Edward became actively involved with the company again, but in a different way. He created a support program for employees' children, ensuring that no child would be left helpless if something happened to their parents. As had happened to Laura, he created scholarships, mentoring programs, support structures, and Laura helped him whenever she could, even as a child, always with ideas, always concerned about other children who might be going through what she went through. The mansion on the Upper East Side, which was once a cold and silent mausoleum, was now always full of life. Laura invited friends for sleepovers, had birthday parties in the garden, had family dinners with Robert and Dr. Beatrice, who became honorary aunt and uncle. Edward smiled more, laughed more, lived more. He felt truly alive for the first time in years. And then, 5 years after that day on the sidewalk, Laura was 12 years old. She had grown up, become an intelligent, determined preteen full of dreams. She was in 7th grade, was class leader, participated in student government, and had a solid group of friends. But more importantly, she had a clear vision of what she wanted to do in the future. "I want to be a doctor," she told Edward one night as they did homework together at the kitchen table. "I want to help children like I was, who are sick or hurt, who need someone to take care of them." Edward felt his chest swell with pride. "You're going to be an incredible doctor," he said, "because you know what it's like to need help, and that makes you more empathetic, more human." It was that same year that Laura's school organized a special event called Inspiring Families, where students were invited to give presentations about their families, about what family meant to them. Laura signed up immediately and spent weeks preparing her speech. Edward helped her, but most of the time he just watched her write, rewrite, practice in front of the mirror, pour her heart into those words. When the day of the presentation arrived, Edward was in the audience along with Robert and Dr. Beatrice, all eager to see. The school was full of fathers, mothers, siblings, grandparents, all there to celebrate their families. When it was Laura's turn, she walked onto the stage with confidence, wearing a yellow dress Edward had given her as a gift, her hair tied in a ponytail, her eyes shining. Edward felt his heart race. She had grown so much, changed so much since that scared little girl on the sidewalk. And yet, when she looked at him in the audience, he saw there the same essence, the same stubborn spark he had seen that first day. Laura took a deep breath, held the microphone, and began to speak. Her voice was clear, firm, full of contained emotion. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Miller, and today I'm going to talk about what family means to me. She paused, looking at the audience, and continued. Many people think that family is about blood, about genetic ties, about who gave birth to you. And that's true for many. But I learned that family can also be about choice, about who stays when the whole world abandons you, about who holds you when you're falling. Edward felt his eyes sting, but he didn't look away. 5 years ago, I was just another child on the streets of New York City. I was alone, hungry, cold, with no one who cared if I would wake up the next day. I had lost hope that my life could be different. I had gotten used to the idea that maybe I didn't matter, that maybe no one would want me. Laura wiped away the tears that began to stream down her face. But then a man stopped in front of me. He was just passing by. He could have ignored me like everyone else did. But he didn't ignore me. He stopped, asked if I had eaten, and gave me a sandwich. And then he came back. And he came back again. And again, until one day he invited me to his house and changed my life forever. Edward was openly crying now, as were Robert and Dr. Beatrice, as were several others in the audience. Laura continued, her voice growing stronger. That man gave me more than food or shelter. He gave me dignity. He gave me love. He gave me a reason to believe that I was important, that my life had value. And when he called me his daughter for the first time, I smiled. I smiled because at that moment my life truly began. She looked directly at Edward. My dad isn't my dad because he has the same blood as me. He's my dad because he chose to be. Because he fought for me when no one else would fight. Because he loved me when I didn't know how to love myself. And I learned from him that family isn't an accident of biology. Family is a daily decision to love, to care, to be present. And I am grateful every day to have been chosen by him, just as I chose him. Because that's what we are, a family that chose each other, and that's the strongest kind of bond there is. The audience erupted in applause. Edward couldn't stop crying, but they were tears of joy, of pride, of overflowing love. When Laura stepped off the stage, he met her halfway and hugged her with all the strength he had. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "So proud." Laura hugged him back. "I wouldn't be anything without you, Dad. You saved my life." Edward shook his head. "No, Laura, we saved each other." That night, after everyone had left, after the emotions had calmed down a bit, Edward and Laura sat in the garden, looking at the stars. The air was cool. There was a gentle breeze, and everything seemed perfect, as if the universe had finally aligned just right. Laura was too grown up to sit on his lap, but she was leaning against his shoulder, and Edward felt complete in a way he hadn't felt since before he lost Camilla and Peter. It wasn't the same completeness. It was different, but it was equally real, equally precious. "Dad," Laura said softly, "do you think my biological dad would be proud of me?" Edward thought of the letter he had found, the words written by Paul Smith, a man he never knew but who had left a legacy of love. "I think he would be extremely proud," he replied. "I think he's looking down from somewhere and smiling, knowing that you are happy, that you are loved as he wanted you to be." Laura was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. And then she said, "When I grow up and become a doctor, I'm going to help children like I was. I'm going to work for free in poor communities. I'm going to make a difference. Because I had a second chance, and I want to give that to other people too." Edward hugged her tighter. "You're already making a difference, Laura. Just by existing, by surviving, by choosing love instead of hate. You are an inspiration," Laura smiled. "I learned from the best." Edward smiled too, and they stayed there for a long time, father and daughter. Two souls who had found each other at the exact moment when both most needed it. Two lives that had been reshaped by the transformative power of a love that chooses, that persists, that wins.